I want you to imagine that one day you get an anonymous message from someone who says that if you don't meet my demands, we're going to publicly release online your personal information, including your phone number, your email address, your home address, your previous passwords, and the names of your family members. You'd be pretty scared, wouldn't you? Well, this is pretty much what happened to one of our guests, Jacob Larsen, who, after experiencing this, spent the better part of his professional career researching into this phenomenon called doxing. In this episode, we interviewed Jacob to learn more about doxing, about his research, which he also recently presented at Black Hat USA in Las Vegas, diving into the world of doxing, discovering how we can also protect ourselves against doxing online. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jacob Larsen from CyberCX.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Man in the Middle podcast. I'm your host, Jeremy Mullally, and today my guest is Jacob Larsen from CyberCX. So Jacob, we really want to welcome you and thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks Jeremy. Looking forward to having a discussion, and hopefully it's something a bit unique and interesting and quite engaging.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And like I was saying before we dived into today, was doxing is something we haven't really covered on this show before, and which is to our detriment, because it's a really fascinating topic and it's a really relevant topic as well. So from the outset, before we keep throwing around that term, I'd love if you could actually just explain for our audience what doxing is and a little bit about its history and how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So doxing, it's a word that people might not be very familiar with, and what it actually is slang for a term called dropping documents or documenting, so doxing. And dropping documents basically means dropping information that links someone's online pseudonym with their real identity. So we've all got different accounts online, but we might not associate our real name with them. And so threat actors, what they'll do is target people with the intention of identifying who they really are, what their name is, what their date of birth, where they're employed, their education history, information about their family members, email addresses, mobiles, and anything else that they can unearth on that person's identity. And the starting point is effectively their online account. So figuring out who that person really is. And the history of doxing is that it's been around for about 25 years. So it really started in the early 2000s, but primarily back then it was a form of hacktivism. And hacktivism is basically hacking activism with the objective of unearthing information on targets of interest that underground communities or hacker groups have a fascination or curiosity with, or want to seek revenge. So a good example of this is in the early 2010s, when the Silk Road was taken down, which was founded by Ross Ulbricht, who actually was pardoned yesterday, which is interesting. But the sentencing judge, her name was Catherine Forrest, and at the time, the kind of underground community felt that the sentence was really unfair, and so they actually doxed Catherine Forrest, the sentencing judge, and released all of her personal information online. Did things like send feces to her house in the mail, and effectively just tried to ruin her credibility. And so that's a good example of how it kind of really started, was this kind of objective-based from a hacktivism and politically or ideologically motivated. But over time, it's really evolved into a financially motivated technique, particularly in the last 5 years with the kind of mainstream rise and use of cryptocurrency, where cryptocurrency being a payment form that, if stolen, it's hard to recover, unlike traditional banking. So if a victim can be targeted and their online username can be used to figure out who they really are, so they can steal those cryptocurrency funds or blackmail and extort them, it's effectively highly profitable. And so it's kind of evolved into this technique which is used for extortion, to either take information, take funds like cryptocurrency from victims, or to persuade them into doing acts. Like, for example, if a person works at a large corporation and they have corporate access to like a privileged environment. An adversary may want to unearth some information about that person in their private life, whether it might be they're having an affair or something like that, dox them, and then threaten that person with the release of their personal information unless they follow through with the demand, like giving access. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And I know you had like a personal interest when it came to doxing, because it's something that happened to you. If you don't mind, I'd love to sort of dive into that story, how like you became interested in doxing, because there was that personal connection that you did have, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I've been in cybersecurity now for quite a while, but even before getting into my role as a penetration tester, I've been researching the kind of like underground community that is involved in doxing. It's kind of like a weird online subculture. And the reason for that is because in my kind of personal time, I've had this kind of personal connection. And that personal connection really derived from me being a victim of doxing. So about 9 years ago in 2015, I should be 10 years now actually, I had an online gaming account with a very rare username. And similar to how we see in social media companies these days, like Instagram, really short username handles, like 2 characters or 3 characters long, or simple dictionary words. They're worth a lot of money, and a lot of celebrities want to acquire them. Well, it was the same thing, but for video game accounts about 10 years ago. And so I had this account, very rare username. It was worth, a couple of $1,000s. And effectively, someone figured out who I was just from my username. They posted all of my personal information on a website. They made like a private link to it so that only I could see it. And it had in there my full name. At the time I was in high school, where I went to school, my family members' names, what they did for work, their owned property and assets, email addresses, phone numbers. And they basically said, if you don't follow through with our demands, we're going to release this information onto this underground website and make it public. And, it was a terrifying experience, particularly at the time being, a minor. I remember opening up that message and feeling time to slow down, and the hairs on my arms prickling and getting goosebumps, and just feeling this immediate sense of nausea and, feeling confused and not knowing what to do. In the end, I felt that, after doing a little bit of research, that if you meet a demand, most often it's just the beginning and there's subsequent requests. And I also recognized that it was really a digital threat. And so I didn't feel at the time that the threat actors actually had the capability or sophistication to maybe carry out some of their threats they had made. And so in the end, I just didn't respond and kind of let it fade away. But after that happened, I took a few years to kind of recover from that, and still continued playing games and having online accounts, but under different usernames to kind of distance myself from that previous online identity. And fortunately, it didn't happen again. But ever since that happened, I wanted to follow the people that had targeted me, and I wanted to follow the communities that they participated in. And so I kind of started this research of following the groups and the threat actors that are involved in this, and following how they use different platforms and kind of intermediary platforms to perpetrate doxing and carry out the extortion payments and things like that, and just followed that, the really weird online subculture that surrounded it. That's kind of the background about how I got involved in it. One thing will make a note of is that there was a key pivotal point in 2023 in March where I found that a particular doxing gang called Vile, Vile, had 2 of its 5 members apprehended by the Department of Homeland Security in the US for carrying out doxing. And I looked at the affidavit for their arrest, and it actually included that they had attempted to extort people for their online accounts, similar to what happened to me, and that they were trying to use this to basically sell the accounts for financial reasons. And it talked a lot about the techniques they used, which I'll cover a bit later. But I knew that this was like an opportunity to deep dive into this group and the platforms they use. And ultimately, that's what my research project ended up being on.
On this particular
group called Vile. Its members, one of which the members I actually managed to interview for my research. So for the listeners at home, I presented at Black Hat USA in Las Vegas last year, effectively releasing the interview transcripts for the first time with these threat actors. There was 5 members of this gang called Vile. One was called KT, who was actually the founder of a website called Doxbin, which was where adversaries host that information. And there was 4 other members called Kane and Weep. They got arrested. And there were 2 outstanding members called Convict and Kane and Ego. And I managed to interview Ego and ask him questions about the techniques they use, why they perpetrate their activities, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And after reviewing what he'd shared with me and speaking to a few other sources, I kind of formulated this research project, which I shared.
Yeah, fantastic. And I definitely want to dive into some of those techniques, but you brought up something that was sort of important, and even before we started recording, like earlier on, doxing was very much more of a digital presence, and even yourself, when it happened to you, you kind of were able to shrug it aside and not realizing what's capable from the physical realm. Can you talk around how there's that interplay or relationship between like that digital threat of like the information being publicly online, and then also what kind of physical things can happen, like whether it be, extortion or even potentially like physical threats that happen in person? Like, can you sort of touch on that kind of relationship for us?
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said earlier, when I was a victim of doxing, it was really a digital threat. And that's basically, an online cybercriminal making a threat to extort me. And if I don't make the payment, they're saying bad things will happen. But they don't really have any evidence of examples that I could find of where victims of doxing had actually had physical threats carried out on them.
So like that follow through.
Exactly, the follow through. And so the follow through made it feel like, okay, this is just a threat. I can probably not make this extortion demand and life will go on. But that's where things have changed recently. So in the last few years, there's been this rise of this service called violence as a service. And this is where basically online cybercriminals work through proxies and middlemen with gangs on the ground who have a physical presence in the location of their victim to carry out violence and physical intimidation tactics against their victim. So that kind of makes a major shift in how doxing is used for extortion. It has evolved from this digital threat to this physical threat that has real life consequences. And it just further exacerbates and amplifies the fear and danger to victims. And so the examples of the types of these services that are carried out, and the way that I figured out all this sort of stuff out is I actually masqueraded myself as a doxing perpetrator and managed to infiltrate a lot of underground online communities, particularly Telegram groups, where these types of services are carried out, make inquiries about victims that I wanted to target, ask them to provide evidence of their services, and I even obtained videos of them carrying out these tactics on victims, which I shared in my presentation, and I can share it with you later on, maybe to include in the show notes.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, and so types of these services include anything from there's swatting, which is doing a phony 000 call to police, saying that there's immediate threat at your location, and then sharing the location of the victim, and ultimately the police bust through the door with guns pointed. And in some instances in the US, this has resulted in civilians being shot and losing their life. But in terms of other techniques carried out by the local gangs more so, there's fire bombings, which is lighting a Molotov cocktail, throwing it through a victim's window, shootings, so taking a firearm, shooting outside their window. And one of the most common ones is bricking, which is basically getting a brick and throwing it through someone's window, either with a message. And the way that these services are carried out is the doxing perpetrators are not doing them. They're acquiring these services that are for hire and for sale by these gangs. And what happens is they tell the gang member or the even independent lone actor, this is the victim, this is their address, this is what I want you to do. The person that carries out the service will name a price, and then the buyer, the doxing perpetrator, transfers those funds to a middleman that acts as a form of escrow. And then when the perpetrator on the ground carries out the violent tactic, they have to record it and then send it to the middleman, who then releases the funds from escrow to the person that carries out the violence. So it's kind of like this. It's almost like a business model for how these services are carried out. And the scariest thing is that it basically is like this troubling trend where all these digital conflicts are kind of manifesting physically. And it's reducing the options that civilians and victims have for protecting themselves.
Yeah, and just how like prevalent is this, Jacob? Like in the sense of these gangs who will like carry out like the physical elements. Like how prevalent is it like around the world? Like we're talking like there's maybe one gang who works in a city and they kind of take care of that, or are there multiple groups of people out there we're just not aware of?
It's a good question. There's definitely hotspots geographically throughout the world. The US is a major area, obviously because of there's more gun violence there than say Australia. The UK is probably second, Europe being third, and in Australia it happens very limited. And that's what really actually made me feel comfortable to even do this research and share it on stage, acknowledging that the likelihood of me being targeted for violence as a service as a result of my research was quite diminished because I didn't find any evidence of it being carried out at scale in Australia specifically. But this isn't just one kind of mafia group offering this. There are so many different groups offering this. Most of the time it is carried out by at least two individuals, one person recording and one person doing the act. But often it's also lone actors. And it doesn't have to be a gang member. It could just be a teenager. There's been cases where, a 19-year-old kid gets caught doing it. And they're just trying to make some money online and they don't care who their victim is. So in terms of like precedent cases, there's an example of a actor that was known by the name Tongue. And he lived in Miami in the US, and he was arrested in 2022 for carrying out physical violence and extortion, particularly with throwing Molotov cocktails through victims' windows. I think he got around 12 years in his sentence for that. But very recently, in June last year in the US, there was a doxing gang. I can't recall the name off the top of my head, but I do include it in my blog for my research. There was a perpetrator that was arrested where they had travelled from Miami to Phoenix in the US to carry out these targeted attacks. They broke into an elderly couple's home, took the elderly man hostage and threatened to cut off his fingers and toes until an extortion demand had been paid. So it's not just this theoretical thing. We have actual precedents in law and cases where actors are being charged for this. But it is primarily in the US as like an epicenter, which is why I presented that research in the US, being more prevalent for that market. But fortunately in Australia, it's not as significant, but it's definitely on the rise.
Yeah, and you were saying that because living in Australia, you felt a little bit safer. Would you consider it differently if you were living elsewhere in the world?
I certainly would not have presented my research or even started it if I'd lived in the US. Absolutely no way. The risk would just be way too high. Effectively, it's a supply and demand situation. There's a lot of people in the US that are willing to carry out these services for a low price. And so for a doxing perpetrator, they have to do an analysis on return of investment. If their victim has $150,000 and the service costs $5,000, they might go, yeah, this is worth it. In Australia, there's very, very limited people that are willing to offer these services, and they're very expensive. And there's also been no precedent where a researcher or a journalist has been targeted for violence as a service. That's not to say that I couldn't be the first, but I think another thing as well is when I went into doing this research, particularly when I interviewed the threat actors involved, I was very transparent that this would be eventually published. So in a way, I was trying to mitigate risk early on. I wanted to make sure that if I did share anything publicly, there was no surprises. Because if a threat actor gets a shock, then they'll lash out and get revenge. So I was very careful to make sure that I publish the full transcript of every question that I asked them to ensure that anything and provide evidence that I hadn't fabricated anything, so that whatever they had shared, it was complete one-to-one what I had released. And the reason they even spoke to me is because at the time that these arrests happened for the members of the Vile gang, one of their leaders posted on Twitter saying that they felt like the media were accusing them of being far-right extremists and neo-Nazis because I believe Vice Media or another agency, or maybe New York Times, released an article labelling them as neo-Nazis. And I knew that they might be, but they probably weren't. And it might have just been a bit more sensationalist journalism. So when I approached them, I said to them, I'm not a journalist, I'm a security researcher. I would love to hear about, I agree that these accusations are probably not 100% correct. Can we talk about more about what you do and why you do it? And that's what allowed them to accept the talk, the interview.
Yeah, so I've been more open to it, like at the very least, to maybe clear their name for whatever maybe might not have been a fair label.
Yeah. So, I mean, yes and no. It's like you start off with those types of questions, the really high-level surface questions about their background before trying to build a relationship with them. Because these interviews took over multiple days and weeks and at a very drip-fed process with questions, just to make sure that I could build trust with them before asking them some difficult questions. Yeah. But that's a bit of background.
Yeah, certainly. I want to circle back to a bit more around, like you mentioned, the techniques, like especially when you spoke to the Vile group gang.
Yes.
Yeah. Could you sort of touch on some of the techniques around doxing and how they manifest?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's two things we can cover. The first one is, how does the extortion process is it carried out in terms of the platforms that are used to assist with extorting victims? And then we can talk about the techniques that they use to unearth the information on victims.
Yeah.
So the first part is that doxing gangs, they basically need a location where they can post the sensitive information of a victim so that it stays on their line forever. Because one of the kind of key requirements for a victim to feel like they're constantly having to look over their shoulder and eventually might make a extortion demand is that it won't go away with time. So for me, when my docs was posted on a website, it was online for a couple of years. Eventually the website got taken down. But there's been this key doxing community called Doxbin. That's spelled Doxbin. But just a warning, don't visit this site unless you've got a VPN. And basically this site's been around since 2018. So they've been live for about 7 years, and they effectively offer doxing perpetrators a location where the information that's posted on their website will never get taken down. And effectively, the way that the extortion process works is that on this website, the perpetrators can pay for an upgraded account, so make a donation, and receive the ability to publish someone's sensitive information and make it private, like add a password to it or add a private link. And then what they can do is send that link to their victim and say, hey, your information right now is on this doxing website. Unless you make this payment, the payment is handled outside of the platform. It's like out of band. And that's one of the reason they do that is to help try and get the information online. And if the payment's not made, then it's gone from private to public. And now your doxed information is on this website, but other threat actors can comment and talk about how they're going to target you. And there's, for context, this website has 300,000 users and almost more than 180,000 published doxers, so victims. So they're definitely the leading doxing platform. And I touched earlier on the structure of the Vile gang. The reason this Vile gang is so prominent and is kind of a leader in this space is because the founder of the Doxbin website is the leader of the Vile gang. So there's this immediate crossover in kind of in adversaries where the person that started the Doxbin website is also the founder of the Vile gang. So that's kind of a background around that platform. Now, in terms of the techniques that adversaries actually use to perform doxing, one of the things that people often think and what they often tell their victims is that They've just gathered information online that's available publicly. So using techniques like open source intelligence or OSINT to search someone's name on Google, find their email address and their passwords and all that sort of stuff. The reality is that they're not using those techniques. They're using very illegal computer intrusion techniques to obtain information on their victims. And when those two members of the Vile gang were arrested in March 2023, the reason that they were arrested is because they'd actually compromised law enforcement accounts to assist with submitting fraudulent emergency data requests. And when I talked to Ego, who I interviewed, he talked about how using this technique called fraudulent emergency data requests is, to quote, a technique that he used all the time, and he taught loads of people to do the same. So it's a very common, prominent technique. And I'll dive deep into what that actually means now. So before we can understand what a fraudulent request is, we need to uncover, well, what is an emergency data request on its own? So an emergency data request, or an EDR for short, is basically a legitimate technique that law enforcement use to obtain information from service providers and social media companies in emergency situations where there's not enough time to get a subpoena. So this could be like an immediate threat to public safety, like a terrorist threat. They have the name of a person or their online account, and that's it. And they send a request to a social media company like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, etc. But also other companies, like it could be LinkedIn or anything, to basically obtain as much information as they can on that user. So it needs to include the request for the name, and that's it, and what can be provided by the social media companies, and they're obligated to respond within 24 hours, but typically it's in about a couple hours, is information like the person's full name, their address, their payment cards they've used, any message history. In some circumstances, no, but often it is included, and their mobile number and their email address. And so basically, if you think about it, if an emergency data request can be submitted fraudulently, it's the fastest way for an adversary to obtain highly accurate and highly sensitive data on a victim in less than 24 hours. And so hackers and doxing perpetrators have effectively taken over this legitimate EDR request process to use it for nefarious purposes to target victims. And so in my research, I uncovered a number of ways that they do this. One of the ways is for some platforms, some social media providers, you simply need a government email address. And this basically means you have a government email address, you receive a link to log into like a law enforcement portal for one of these social media companies, you submit a request, and then they either accept or deny it and provide an answer. And effectively, people think, well, if you need a government email, that must be pretty hard, right? But they're available for $70 on underground forums. So, you can buy one very quickly and immediately send that request. Now, obviously, the cost of the government email depends on whether it's a first world or third world nation. So government emails for like Pakistan, Brazil, etc., they're much cheaper than, say, US or Australian government email addresses. But I even found an example speaking to a threat actor who not only sold government email addresses, but sold the ability for you to create any government email you wanted. So that means it doesn't mean like hacking someone's existing government email. It means you can provide the name and they'll create a government email and you can log into it.
So you're actually creating a government persona.
You're creating a government persona, a legitimate government persona. This isn't a phishing domain. This is the genuine .gov domain. And the way that they do this is they basically hack government infrastructure and then get to a position where they can create any government identity they want. And I asked this person, I said, hey, can I buy the access you have to do this? They said, sure, $500 for Mozambique, which is an African nation government. So that's not a lot, $500 to create any government identity you want. Now, obviously, submitting these requests, like I said before, if it comes from a third world nation, the acceptance rate is a bit lower because of maybe not having as much trust relationships between that government and that social media provider. But if the request comes from like a US government agency email, it's a much higher success rate. So I also wanted to speak to adversaries that sold the ability to submit fraudulent requests coming from those countries. And I spoke to one adversary who ultimately said that they had access to this aggregator platform. And I'll explain what that means is, I talked about how before you need a government email address to receive a link, log into a portal for the platform and submit the request. Well, the industry is aware that some of these requests can be fraudulent. So some companies and startups and other established businesses have created these platforms, which I call an aggregator platform, where the social media companies sign up. And the idea of this business is that they manually validate all the requests that go through to determine that they're legitimate. And so some government workers can get verified profiles on these aggregator platforms, which means they've already been validated as legitimate, and then send the request. And the idea is that it's more safe. But then I spoke to adversaries that sold verified profiles on those aggregator platforms. So kind of defeating a second layer of controls, and effectively I spoke to a threat actor who had a US Department of Justice and an FBI.gov email address that he compromised and was using to submit requests to platforms. So he showed me a screenshot as kind of proof of purchase, because I was inquiring to make a transaction, of him logged into a Facebook, WhatsApp, and TikTok law enforcement panel with a US Department of Justice email address. And he said that every request he has sent has 100% been accepted. And so I asked him how much was it to submit those 3 requests. He says $500 US. So it just goes to show you that doxing perpetrators can acquire this information, such sensitive and enriched data from these providers at such a low cost, and effectively there's nothing you can do about it as a victim. Which is quite scary, to be honest.
Yeah, so it seems that really the only thing preventing them is, I guess, like the legal ramifications and the moral ramifications of doing that. Nothing like a financial barrier or even like a technical barrier by the sounds of it.
Exactly, because a lot of these perpetrators of doxing are not sophisticated cyber criminals. They're lone actors that, as long as you have funds and a bit of know-how of speaking to the right underground groups, then you're good to go. You know what I mean? Like, you can go from having nothing on a victim to knowing their complete identity in 24 hours. Now, obviously, when an adversary does this, there are next steps that they have to do. After they've obtained this information on a victim, the key things is their email address and their mobile number, and obviously their physical address. They'll always start with an online extortion attempt first before escalating to physical because of the investment required. But it's easier to, if you want to steal money from your victim, just try and hack into their accounts first. So they'll try and compromise their email. If they can compromise the person's primary email account, then they can send, password reset requests to, cryptocurrency exchanges, banking, corporate access, etc. Receive a link to change their password, change it, delete multi-factor authentication, and then log in. But in order to get access to the email address, for some people, they just use a password, but some people use multi-factor authentication as well, which is important. But another thing is that a lot of email providers offer SMS-based two-factor authentication, which is where you receive a 6-digit code to your mobile number, not through an authenticator-based app. So another technique that doxing perpetrators use when they want to take over someone's email is a technique called SIM swapping. And that's where they basically use malicious insiders in mobile carriers to perform a port out for a SIM number to a SIM card they control. So let's say, I've got your email address, your mobile number, and all your information from the service provider, and I want to try and hack your account before I extort you, just to see if it works. What I can do is speak to my malicious insider inside a mobile carrier and say, hey, move Jeremy's mobile number to this SIM card. And what happens is your SIM card goes dead, your mobile number gets ported to my SIM card that I control, and then I can click forgotten password on your email.
Going to you.
Yeah, and then I get the code, and then I log in, and then I hack your entire identity. So, that's kind of what they do. So when it comes to protecting yourself, you can really only focus on hardening your accounts and your online identity from being hacked, per se, than resolving fraudulent emergency data requests from an individual's perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And even those access requests, it might be a naive question, but what generally what's the information available? And I suppose through social media accounts and so on, there's a lot. But generally, what do you find are the data points that are available to someone hacking or having that access request and then being accepted?
Yeah, so I think previously, before the emergency data requests kind of got abused, people could obtain a lot of information just by looking at someone's Facebook account publicly. They could see their name, their date of birth, probably their email address, and probably their family members. But you've probably seen a rise in the last few years, a big shift for big tech companies to focus on privacy, like locking profiles, which is honestly awesome from our perspective. But then we've got the fraudulent emergency data requests. So if that request is accepted, what is provided back to the requester or the doxing perpetrator is, the name, the email address, the mobile number, payment card history, and sometimes message history. So if you think about it, if you've, with a family member, sent them your login passwords via message history, or you've sent them some, graphic content, like explicit content that could be used to extort you, or a whole bunch of stuff, it will be included. Message history isn't provided by default, but sometimes when these emergency data requests are sent, the doxing perpetrator will attach an additional fabricated letter that details exactly what they want with a fake signature and sign off from a head of department or something. And then the provider might provide additional things like message history, etc. So really what they get is the email address, the mobile, and the physical address. They'll try hack you first, but if they can't, then they'll go to physical extortion, which is talking about the violence that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, for sure. And the motivations, are they typically down the line of the financial? Because by the sounds of what we've been saying, the extortion angle, it's usually been around to, receive funds of some sort, and even if they're bypassing it by hacking themselves. Are there other motivations that are first of all, is that the largest motivation? And then if not, what are the other motivations out there?
Yeah, so it's predominantly financially motivated because it's cybercrime. It's financially driven cybercrime. Primarily targeting people that hold cryptocurrency, which in previous years wasn't a lot of people, but now with the rise of Bitcoin ETFs and retirement funds holding crypto, individuals are adding it as a part of their investment portfolio. So in a way, actors are kind of working their way down from the easiest targets to the bottom, which is elderly people, older adults, and then eventually teenagers as well. But in some cases, because these individuals that are engaged in doxing are quite erratic, and even in my interview with Ego, he admitted to having schizophrenia and not really feeling a sense of remorse or empathy for his victims. Sometimes they can have purely the motivation of thrill, which sounds kind of crazy. And sometimes it can be targeting someone they don't like. I've seen examples where in these groups, they've been playing Fortnite with another person that's beat them, and they go, I want to find out who this person is, and send someone into their house. As crazy as that sounds.
So it's more of a petty kind of aspect.
Exactly, there's a thrill and excitement in sort of feeling like they have control to make someone do anything they want, which is terrifying. Mm-hmm. But there's also this other side of doxing where more sophisticated groups that are trying to compromise corporate organizations for, getting initial access before they go and deploy ransomware or something like that. They will target people for corporate access. So it's not financially motivated. So a lot of the time people ask the question, well, I don't have any cryptocurrency, I probably won't be a victim. But if you work in an organization, you work in finance, payroll, technology, any of these fields, someone might target you purely to get your login, to log into your corporate environment, so that they can use that as an initial attack vector into actually compromising the organization and extorting them. And I can go a bit more into detail about examples of that. So last year, well, I think maybe late 2023, everyone was very familiar with a group called Scattered Spider, which was the initial access broker for a ransomware group that compromised, it was either MGM Resorts or Caesars Entertainment, a really big casino in the US. And Scattered Spider is basically a group of lone actors that are affiliated, and they had members that were on the staff at the Doxbin website. So there's this direct connection between the adversaries on Doxbin carrying out doxing activities and those that are attributed to, cybersecurity adversaries that are compromising organizations with ransomware. So there's definitely a connection there for corporate access, but it's primarily financially motivated.
Yeah, mostly the financial motivation, yeah. I want to go to are there any kind of success stories from people who have been victims of doxing, where they've been able to, I guess, come out on top on the other side. So not having to either, pay a ransom or anything like that, and also not face like any sort of physical violence and things like that. Like, are there any kind of like big success stories around that, Jacob?
To be honest, there isn't any big success stories, but I've definitely seen.
It's very frightening.
Yeah, so I think the reason is that most people that are victims don't report this at all because they feel a sense of helplessness.
I was going to say, yeah, like, is there an aspect that they, you definitely feel like a victim, and there's almost a level of shame to it?
100% level of shame. And in some cases, like when it's, say, like we're talking about people getting targeted by Fortnite, we're talking about minors. They don't know how to have this open dialogue with their parents that they might be getting targeted. And even for adults, it's kind of like, well, what's going to happen? This adversary is based overseas. My small report to the local police agency doesn't feel like it's going to do anything or anything's going to carry out. Because another thing is, on the Doxman website, they actually maintain a transparency report where they log every single government agency request publicly that they've received. And they've received about 200 requests now, about 160 when I did my research last year. And a lot of those requests, like more than 60% of them get denied. A lot of the time it's, Doxman does have some rules, surprisingly, for what information is released. They don't accept any content that's explicit of minors, nude photos and things like that. And they don't accept any material on people under the age of 15. 15 or 16, it's one of those numbers. But they don't do any kind of manual review of anything that's posted to see if it meets that criteria. So sometimes government agencies will send requests and say, hey, take this down. And they review it and they go, actually, this doesn't meet our terms and conditions, we're going to take it down. But when you've got 180,000 doxers and you've only got 60 that have been taken down in the last 7 years, that kind of puts into perspective how many people are actually getting out of this, and feeling supported. But I think doxing itself, there's no kind of law that kind of bans doxing. And so that also makes it hard for victims to want to kind of rise up above this. We have seen a really major shift in the last 2 years. I think the Australian government's probably leading in this area, the E-Safety Commissioner. They've actually released for parents guides on, what is doxing, how to protect yourself, and how to report it and receive support. The Department of Homeland Security has done that as well in the US, and I think there's a few other agencies in the UK and Europe as well. So there's kind of this, I think we'll start to see more people kind of rising above it, but at the same time, it's only getting worse in terms of it's going from digital to physical threats now.
Yeah, the violence as a service aspect is, on the rise as well. So is that meeting the, I guess the opposite of law enforcement coming up against these attacks? Yeah,
so one good thing that I've noticed in the US particularly, where most of the cases of people getting arrested for this is happening, is when it comes to investigating this type of crime, law enforcement are limited by how much resources they can gather, right, to expedite it. But because of this doxing shifting from being a digital threat to a physical threat, in some circumstances, they've been able to classify it as domestic terrorism and therefore expedite a lot of their investigations, get additional resources and access to additional information that allows them to really pursue the perpetrator of this at a greater speed and velocity, which is a really good sign and indicator, to be honest. But in some cases, when these eventually get to trial, what people actually get charged with, it might not be domestic terrorism, it might be something else. But there's definitely this is a key focus area for law enforcement, because within doxing, there's also things like sadistic extortion, where and we have seen this in Australia as well, where it's not financially motivated, it's about convincing minors, particularly young teenage girls, to self-harm and share photos of that, and it's purely for the enjoyment of these doxing perpetrators. So we saw one case late last year in Sydney where there was a 40-year-old man had basically been arrested for convincing a minor to self-harm and share that content with him. And ultimately, the child actually confessed it to the kids' helpline, and then got coaching from the kids' helpline to talk to their parents and go to the police about it. So it is happening in Australia, and it is happening abroad. So we're seeing this kind of gradual shift. I think with more arrests and more precedents and really like long prison sentences for these acts, we'll start to see maybe the criminal underground deteriorate a little bit. Another thing as well that's been a good kind of indicator of things progressing in a good direction is late last year, Telegram CEO actually got in trouble with French law enforcement for not censoring explicit content. And since Telegram has now started implementing a bit more active monitoring of the fraud groups that are associated on their platforms, because Telegram is kind of the community chat side of the Doxing platform, they actually got their main channel deleted by Telegram. Right. So we're seeing this real gradual shift to a crackdown on this group. So it's heading in the right direction, but there's no key examples of people rising above it.
Yeah, I mean, that's unfortunate to hear, but it sounds like, at least on the law enforcement side of things, is it fair to say that the convictions that are coming down are usually, it's not doxing itself, because like you said, it's not like there's anything particularly illegal about that. It's more the things surrounding it. So for example, if they were like that case you gave of someone in Sydney, like if there's like self-harm involved, if there's minors involved, there's almost like a subset that is illegal, and they're going in on that side.
Exactly.
Is that usually how these people get convicted?
Yeah, so like if we think about doxing, right, like the actual posting of a person's sensitive information on a website publicly, that in itself is not illegal. And what makes it not illegal is that, particularly if you look at the US and Australian law, in order for someone to be, kind of prosecuted for sharing information, there needs to be a direct written threat for physical harm in that information. And Doxbin, being aware of this, has actually banned direct written threats in the docs itself, right, on the website. So someone might post that personal information on the website, the Doxing website, send it to the victim, and then supporting an additional message saying the direct written threat. But because it's not in the actual docs post on that website, it technically doesn't violate any of the laws because it doesn't include a direct written threat. So it's really hard for law enforcement to prove that like published text on a website of someone's name and address on its own, it causes distress or is a threat for harm. And that's got the kind of gap in policy that is allowing like Doxbin to permeate and live online for so long. Particularly because in the US as well, there's this law called the Communications Decency Act. And it's basically a law that applies to all online websites in the US where if a user uploads content to your platform, the platform itself is not legally liable for what the users upload, even if it's used for harm. And a good example of this is Twitter or X, where a few years ago, a female game developer called Brianna Wu, she had some users of Twitter upload to the platform her address, her docs, make death threats, rape threats, all these sorts of intimidation tactics. She sued Twitter for allowing these people to upload that content, but Twitter won the case under the Communications Decency Act because they cannot be legally liable or held responsible for what their users say and do. And so that's ultimately what Doxbin has done as well. They say, well, we let people post whatever they want. As long as it doesn't include a direct written threat, no worries. But speaking to and interviewing the people on Doxbin and asking them questions like, Doxbin says no threats are allowed. What do you think? One of the actors I spoke to said, they're certain that the point of it, whilst it's widely known and accepted that the point of posting on Doxbin is for intimidation and extortion, they don't include that written threat so that the docs will stay online, basically. So, yeah, that's not great.
Yeah, and is there any sign of that policy changing? And maybe I don't know if you said Australia's a bit ahead with these sorts of things, at least in Australia, Doxbin not being able to take advantage of that, gap in policy.
I think doxing itself, the term doxing, isn't really defined in legislation. It's they really rely on communications laws, anti-stalking laws, computer intrusion laws, and just fraud, which kind of covers those other areas surrounding doxing itself, like the extortion process and obviously physical violence and stuff. Now, in Australia, we're definitely leading from the perspective of providing support for victims, but not so much from changing law. In the US, some individual states, like Phoenix, for example, have actually defined doxing in legislation and condemned it. And ultimately, there needs to be this shift from if the text doesn't have a written threat, it's not a problem, to maybe a consensus that the sharing of personal information online without the person's consent should be kind of universally accepted to have the intent of malicious dissemination, and have the intent of causing distress. And if that can be kind of coded into law, then it'll be a lot easier to prove that that text on its own is, being used for doxing and extortion. And a second component is if the threat actor is not posting how they obtain that information, they can just say, I found this online publicly. They're not saying, I sent a fraudulent request impersonating police to get this information. They're just saying, I found it on Google, it's public, right? And there's no way to kind of prove that.
Yeah, there's no way to verify that. And do you think having that, that codified in law would help to prevent attacks in any way, or more just a case to crack down on criminals who are releasing that information? It
would definitely give law enforcement more avenues for taking down the platforms. I think what would be really good is, because particularly with the Doxing website, like it's still live to this day, it's been along for years. They have had some minor ownership changes in terms of the perpetrators running the website. But if we can see a big crackdown in major players in this field getting apprehended and maybe this site getting terminated, then that would be cause a major disruption to the industry. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is hosted offshore and it's hard to take down. So law enforcement just need more avenues where they can pursue the actors and the platforms. Because a lot of the time there's the hosting of the information, the platform itself, and then there's the perpetrator. And I think if more perpetrators are arrested and the platforms are taken down, then it will make a material difference. But the reality is that another platform will pop up. Just like a darknet market gets shut down, another one comes up 6 months later. And the industry will always be like that because it's just a means to an end for this extortion and because it's so highly profitable. But I think we'll hopefully start to see more arrests, more precedents to hopefully deter people from engaging in this. Because particularly for some of the members of Vile that weren't apprehended, they're kind of seen as untouchable and they're kind of accepted as untouchable by these 300,000 users on this site. And I think a lot of people feel like their operational security is so strong that no one could ever find them. And I think if the law enforcement can actually take down some of these key players, it'll send a very strong and clear message that it doesn't matter who you think you are, that law enforcement will come and find you. And I think that should deter people from engaging in it.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think that could certainly offer a deterrence capacity for that kind of thing. I do want to ask a bit more of a technical question just on the role of encryption tools play on either doxing in general, but both on enabling it, but then also preventing it as well. Is there a bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with encryption, all these social media platforms are encrypting the data. It's a good question. I know that for Facebook, with Facebook Messenger, you can have end-to-end encryption, where only you and the person you're speaking to might be able to see the messages because the provider doesn't have the key to decrypt the message. So maybe if a fraudulent emergency data request was submitted, then they wouldn't be able to provide message history, but they would still be able to provide your name, email address, all that other stuff they've gathered from all sorts of stuff over the years. So it's useful, but it's not really
it's not a silver bullet.
Well, it's not even. It's not even. Yeah, it's not gonna. It's not gonna do anything, unfortunately. So, there's some services out there that advertise themselves as being able to help people take down their information from Doxbin. I won't name names specifically, but these are a scam. And even Doxbin themselves have publicly announced that they will never take payment to take down a dox. So it's just that there's definitely companies out there that are trying to basically prey on victims and fleece them for tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, exploit them in a vulnerable situation.
For sure. There's things that they can do, like you can, if you've had a docs post on a website, you can message Google and ask them to unindex the page from the Google search, so that basically if someone types in your name, that page isn't referenced.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they can't find it on a different search engine. And there's unlimited search engines, so someone with enough, it'll still stay online. One good thing that has happened is the Wayback Machine, like the Internet Archive. They've blocked the Doxing platform from being able to archive pages. So if, say, your docs got published and then got taken down, it would never have been indexed as previously on there. So no one can kind of take a copy of that page and archive it, which is helpful. But yeah, there's the biggest thing when it comes to protecting like victims of doxing. It's basically about hardening your personal security of your email account, because someone might have your address and post it online, but if they can't hack into your identity and steal everything, making sure your multi-factor authentication you set up is authenticator app based, not SMS based. Doing like a general search of the internet for yourself, like trying to dox yourself almost, like see what you can find out there, see if you can have it be taken down, or even just knowing that there's stuff out there you can't get taken down, adjusting your kind of digital presence to know that, hey, an attacker does have that on me, what could that be used against me? Like for example, if one of your security questions for your work or your personal account is what is the name of your dog, and your dog's name is publicly posted and you can't delete it, change your security question, So kind of, you almost need to take like the adversary's perspective on your own identity and take steps to kind of mitigate yourself from further compromise.
Yeah. Fantastic. Unfortunately, we are coming to the end of this conversation, Jacob, and I do want to ask you one more thing, because you already talked about what we can do on the individual level from a, shoring up your own security and so forth. But should you ever be in a situation like that you obviously experienced yourself, where you have been doxed and there is that communication line between the attacker or the criminal that's done it. Generally, what are the steps you take to move beyond that?
For sure.
In that situation,
you definitely want to immediately cease communication and not even send them a single message. If you will be harassed, they will probably try and reach you on multiple avenues. But what you want to do is make sure that all your social media accounts are set to private or potentially deleted if you've been contacted through social media, which is often done. You want to make sure that obviously you've got set unique passwords for all of your accounts and you've got multi-factor authentication enabled with an authenticator-based app option. Obviously, you want to submit a police report. So speak to the Australian Federal Police. Also send the request to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. They'll more so help you with the reporting it than provide post-incident support, whereas someone from police will be involved in that. You would also want to contact the Australian E-Safety Commissioner. They have a lot of different resources, and they take a really gentle approach to helping victims, and they're quite empathetic. But the biggest thing is to just not engage in any communication with them. Do not make any payment, and certainly do not speak to them at all. It can feel relentless and it can feel hopeless, but after time they will move on to another victim. And yeah, that's my best advice.
Yeah, because like you were saying, even in cases where like there's say like a ransom payment to be made, based on your research, when those payments are made, it's usually not the last, is it? No,
often they say, this is the first, they don't say it's going to be ongoing, but as soon as you make that first payment, it's monthly, We've talked about the personal privacy, but from a physical safety perspective as well, you definitely want to make sure that you have CCTV set up at home. Like for me, when I released my research, I knew that there was an elevated risk. So definitely have, make sure you've got, you lock your doors and you set up CCTV at your home. And if you live alone, don't be afraid of going and staying with someone for a few weeks until you feel the threat has kind of died down a little bit more.
Yeah, okay. Very good advice there. Jake, I really want to thank you for coming on the show today, and I hope that perhaps we can explore this more in future and have you on the show again. But if people want to find out a bit more about doxing beyond what we've spoken about today, how can they find out a bit more about that, whether it's through your own research or other sort of avenues out there?
Yeah, sure. So the best place to go would be to see my presentation either on YouTube. So you can search Black Hat USA, From Doxing to Doorstep, Exposing Privacy Intrusion Techniques Used by Hackers for Extortion, or alternatively going on my website, which is larsencyber.com. So LARSENCYBER.com. Alternatively, feel free to reach me on LinkedIn at larsencyber, and I'll respond to you.
Fantastic. Jacob, I want to thank you again for coming on the show, and I'm looking forward to speaking again in the future.
Yeah, great. No worries. Thank you.
Thanks very much.